I have to admit that even though I've criticized self-help so many times on this channel, it is still such a guilty pleasure of mine. No matter how hard I try, I can't seem to stop myself from reading these books. I love the idea of having some strategies and tactics and new ideas that can help me to improve my life in some way. But that being said, there are some very core principles of self-help that I fundamentally disagree with. So this video is about debunking some of those core principles and all the self-help advice the industry would never give you. So the first principle of the self-help world I want to push back against is the idea that knowledge, advice, wisdom is to be found predominantly in self-help books, when I think there are so many other ways of knowing that often offer far greater sources of wisdom for our lives. For example, I think our bodies offer a great source of wisdom for what we truly want and how we truly feel, but self-help generally gets us disconnected from our bodies because the emphasis is so much on discipline, control, and mastery over our bodies. So over time, we forget to listen to what our bodies are trying to communicate to us. Listening to the natural wisdom of our bodies can take so many different forms. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, which explores how trauma that we experience can manifest in the pain in our bodies. So often taking a look at where our pain is residing in our bodies can give us an indication of some mental and emotional pain that we are experiencing and what steps might be important to take from here on out. Sometimes when I'm sad, I feel that sadness in my heart. Sometimes I feel the sadness in my gut. And I wonder what these things can be signaling to you when the physical pain is in different areas. How this manifested for me was that for several years I had blood in one area of my body, and medically there was nothing wrong with me according to the doctor, but this was an area where I had had a lot of harm done to me. And so I think my body was telling me that even though I didn't need medical attention, there was still a lot of trauma residing there that needed some emotional, psychological investigation. Another sort of similar story that really stuck with me was from Wild by Jay Griffiths, which is one of my favorite books of all time. In the book, she references from, I believe it was a shaman or indigenous man from the Amazon. I can't remember the exact details, but essentially she was saying that this man was walking on a path and he went off the path and he broke his leg. And within his belief system, this event meant that he was taking the wrong path in life. And so I don't know if I necessarily believe in that, but at the same time, I kind of like the idea of the fact that sometimes what happens to us physically can also give us an indication of something else going on more broadly in our lives. Aside from that, I also think that listening to the wisdom of our body can be as simple as just understanding what is important for our bodies. I talked about this more in my time management video, where I was talking about how I, as a night owl, need to listen to my body clock as opposed to the socially imposed ideas that waking up early and going to sleep early is somehow better. And I also talked about the fact that my neurodivergent brain functions on a very different rhythm than the majority of people, and also how complex PTSD made me need to sleep for a long time, and that was me listening to my body and what my body needed, even though on the outside it looked like I was being lazy. I think the point is still that it's important for us to understand the individual needs of our particular bodies, rather than just adopting what we think we are supposed to do based on arbitrary social ideals that have been imposed on us. Another source of wisdom that the self-help industry tends to neglect is the wisdom of nature. On a practical level, I think we've all had that experience of being in nature, and when we're so still and quiet in our beings, that's often when the best revelations and epiphanies and ideas come to us. And on a more spiritual level, I also believe in animism, which is the idea that there is a spirit that resides in all of nature, that animals, plants, and mountains are all alive somehow, and that they're seeking to have a relationship and communicate to us in some way. So many of us have lost the ability to communicate with nature. We've lost the language of nature because white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, and so on necessitated our separation from and superiority to nature and nature's way of knowing and the general despiritualization of the world. But I think if we really try, we can relearn the language of nature. I'm definitely not there just yet myself. I still have a lot to learn. But there are so many traditions across the world that can help us to regain this way of knowing. Chief Luther Standing Bear of the Native American Lakota people wrote that the earth was a library, and its books were the stones, leaves, grass, brooks, and the birds and animals. For me, the way I try to practice learning the language of nature is to spend a lot of time with one life form out in nature for as long as possible. And over time, a series of impressions come to me, some thoughts and ideas start to form inside of me, and if I can be as still and quiet in my being as possible, suddenly there are some directions or some ideas or wisdom or something that I feel the need to follow, and that feels like it's not coming from me, it's coming from something outside of me that is telling me something. It's not very often, if ever, that I'm fully able to tap into that, but like learning any language, it's a practice and a skill to develop over time. Very much related to the idea that there is wisdom to be found in nature, I also think plant medicines can be such an incredible source of wisdom in our lives. I really love that Mexi in a Rev Left Radio episode referred to psychedelics as plant allies. If done in a safe and controlled way, they can be incredibly powerful at giving us new ideas and advice and new directions of where to go in our lives and what to do, and diminishing our ego. Even the renowned expert on trauma and addiction, Gabor Mate, talked about how one dose of psychedelics can often do the same amount of work as years and years of therapy just in one sitting. That's how powerful these things can be. And I think I've had this experience myself because I've only had the opportunity to do them once in my life. But I remember I just spent hours and hours crying, but in a really therapeutic kind of way, because I don't cry that often, and it was really helpful just to release so many emotions that had been pent up inside of me. And at one point I started visualizing a friend of mine who had died, and I started to hit him with a stick in my imagination, which sounds terrible, but I realized there was all this anger inside of myself that I still had towards him. But because you're not allowed to feel anger towards dead people, because we're all supposed to romanticize them, I had never really allowed myself to feel anger, especially as anger is a hard emotion for me to experience in general. So I was hitting him with a stick for such a long time, and then after that I feel so much of that pent up anger and rage inside of me dissipated. And at one point I started to masturbate because I wanted to feel what it was like to have an orgasm whilst on these plant medicines. And my body transformed into my mum's body and my grandma's body and my great-grandma's body. And it sounds really weird, but I feel like it was such a beautiful experience of connecting my own desire for my own sexual liberation with this long lineage of women before me who hadn't had that opportunity to be liberated in that way. And so I think it really encouraged my desire for sexual liberation, also my desire to talk about sexual liberation so much more on this channel and on our live stream channel called A Little to the Left, and really informed how I wanted to treat my body in general. So that was also a really beautiful experience. I've also heard many accounts of people talking about how taking them dissolved their sense of self and made them much aware of the interconnectedness of all beings and the oneness of everything. And it can be a really powerful thing to get rid of a lot of these socially imposed ideas. And that isn't to say that they will inevitably just help everyone. I know there's a lot of right-wing toxic people who take them and swear by them, but it doesn't seem to help them to improve very much. But I think it's worth exploring nevertheless. Another source of wisdom that is so underrated and never really discussed in self-help books is the idea that so much wisdom can come from stories, whether it's stories in music, films, or fiction books. I can get the same piece of advice 100 times in self-help books, or be told universal principles, or read 100 different studies, and yet it isn't until I hear one personal account of one person's journey into that thing or experience with whatever it might be that it really resonates. Because until I feel it on an embodied, visceral level, it's only ever a very academic matter. I'm only ever thinking about it in an intellectual way. And it makes sense because we are social creatures after all. We've evolved to communicate and to relate to each other via stories. And the final source of wisdom I wanted to address was the idea that there is so much wisdom to be found within ourselves already. And I think sometimes self-help can actually do more harm than good because it gets us disconnected from the wisdom that we already have within ourselves, because it's constantly imposing so many shoulds and should nots and do this and don't do that, that we aren't able to really access that which is already within ourselves. Self-help is especially insidious in this way because I think that in order to sell books, you have to sell solutions. You can't just say, maybe this will work for you, maybe it won't, because it isn't as enticing as promising this one-size-fits-all type of panacea for all your life problems. But just because something works for one person doesn't mean it will work for us. It's like wearing someone else's clothes. Just because it fits them doesn't mean it will fit us. And these days I'm often thinking to myself that I'm constantly filling my brain with so much information and reading 10 books a month or something ridiculous. But maybe the best thing I could do is to cut all of those things out, all of these outside sources of information, and instead see what emerges when I have no outside input, what is coming from me already if I allow that spaciousness to emerge. Seeking all this outside input can just distract us or confuse us from what we already know to be true. I think it would be much healthier for all of us on a personal and planetary level to just embrace the fact that there is no one best way of living and being. What might work for us might not work for another person. These days, I can't take anything as universal anymore because I feel like we are such multifaceted beings. What works at one time in my life might not work at another. So I think one of the best things we could do is to let go completely of imposed wisdom and ideas of how we should live our lives, and instead have the courage to follow our own paths, to be moved by our own influences. The psychiatrist Carl Jung referred to this as the individual path, which is, in his words, the way you make for yourself, which is never prescribed, which you do not know in advance, and which simply comes into being itself when you put one foot in front of the other. Another core principle of self-help I want to push back against is this hustle, grind, work culture that sets up this idea that in order to get what you want, you've got to work as hard as you can. And if it's not a struggle, you're not trying hard enough, and your success is dependent on how hard you struggle. But recently, I've really come to this idea that I actually think the opposite is the case. that if something is such a struggle, it's a sign that something is very, very wrong. I came to this idea kind of by accident when I was filming a YouTube video. It was just going to go onto my Patreon page, so I felt no one was really going to watch it. So I just put some bullet points down on a piece of paper, and I spoke naturally and casually from the heart, just based off of a few bullet points. And afterwards, when I watched the video, I was so annoyed because I felt like the video was so much better than so many other videos I had filmed that I had absolutely labored over and just spent so long perfecting every sentence and saying the same sentence to the camera over and over again and reading so many books for every single script. Like, oh, I didn't need to be doing this all this time just by writing some bullet points and speaking from the heart. It actually comes across so much better. And it's just annoying when you realize that so much of the effort you put in wasn't necessary all along. But it makes a lot of sense, I think, that sometimes when we overwork something, we lose a lot of the spirit and zest and soulfulness of the thing. And when you're not enjoying the thing, people can also sense that. And so it then becomes not as successful as a result. Whereas I think when you're doing something with love and joy, people want to be a part of that thing. People are just gravitating towards that. And I think this goes for so many other things, not just with creativity. I think we've all had that experience of someone who is so desperate for a partner that they never find one. Then as soon as they let go of trying to find one, suddenly one appears. Or people who are so desperate to be happy that they end up actually being the least happy of all, whereas people who don't care that much about being happy tend to be relatively content. We also see this in nature. If you're so hasty to force unnatural growth, the plants will wither and die. Whereas if you bear with the process of growth, dormancy, cyclicity, reseeding, then things naturally emerge as and when they are ready to. And I know there are plenty of examples out there of people who did hustle and grind, and that is how they made it. But I've rarely ever known anyone who actually did the hustle, grind, discipline thing who didn't also love the hustle, grind and discipline. Like the people who are so disciplined to go running every morning, they love that process of running. Of course, it's going to be easy for them to work hard at something when they're following their curiosities and their joys and doing what energizes them. And that's why these days I've come to this mentality where I think if something really is that hard, then maybe it just isn't for me. Rather than pushing through and killing myself to try and do that thing, I take a step back and ask myself, okay, why isn't this working? What is not aligning? Why isn't this flowing? What can I do about it? A framework that I love so much that I've been constantly invoking these days when I feel like it should be easy, it shouldn't have to be this hard, I shouldn't have to grind, is the martyr versus trickster archetype. I talked about this in my breadsheet video, but I want to bring it up again because I think that self-help, it fits very nicely into the martyr archetype, because the martyr is classically very solemn and serious and austere and self-sacrificial, and the trickster is totally against that sort of self-help martyr archetype and instead is transgressive and playful and light and doesn't take things so seriously and says, oh, it's got to be hard, fuck that, I'm going to find a way around this. And I think that's such a more beautiful way to live in general, just to find the playfulness in life. And so a lot of the time I ask myself, okay, how can I invoke the trickster in this situation? How can I make this easy? How can I get around this? And the way that I'm invoking the trickster these days is by saying, you know what, I'm not going to read 7 books for just one YouTube video. I'm not going to spend 7 hours recording this and saying the same sentence over and over. I'm going to let things flow naturally and talk about things when I'm passionate about them and when I'm really feeling them, and let it all just be a much more fun and joyful endeavor. And gone are the days where I go to the gym in the morning at 5 a.m. Instead, I'm now in this period of life where I'm playing volleyball and badminton with friends and making exercise something that's actually fun and playful and that I look forward to. And gone are the days where I see leftism as this misery-making, martyrdom, self-sacrificial endeavor where people feel the weight of my intentions and are put off. Now I'm trying to do the contributions that genuinely bring joy to me, and that way I feel bring joy to the world more generally. The funny thing about this whole conversation about things needing to be easy is that ironically these days we are so used to working hard that somehow we've gotten to a point where doing the easy things, doing the things that are playful and light and joyful has actually become the harder thing to do. Julia Cameron, the incredible author of The Artist's Way, one self-help book I would actually recommend to everyone, made this point really well in a recent interview.
When I go out to teach, if I say, I have a tool, it's a nightmare. You'll have to wake up 45 minutes early. You'll have to be vulnerable. You'll have to really work at getting the 3 pages done. They say, oh, work, we get it. We're ready to work on our creativity. And then if I say, well, I'd like you to do something else. Once a week, I'd like you to take yourself on a solo, festive, enchanting expedition to do something that intrigues or interests you. In other words, I want you to play. And people are immediately offended, arms get crossed, and they say, play? I don't see what play has to do with creativity.
So I think on a personal and planetary level, we would all benefit so much if we let go of the idea that life has to be hard and that hardship is a sign of progress. To unlearn a lot of this, I think it can be helpful to ask, in what ways have I internalized that this has to be hard? Where did that come from? How did it get here? And what would this look like if this were easy? Another core principle of self-help I want to challenge is that the whole industry gets us to be successful by societal metrics of success, rather than getting us to challenge those standards in the first place. I'm not going to labour this point too much because I talked about this in far more detail in my Self-Help is a Scam video, but essentially we are encouraged to pursue money, status, success. Men are supposed to be traditionally masculine, strong and tough and have investments and earn a lot of money and be muscular. Women are encouraged to embrace traditional femininity, being a girl boss in a hot girl body. So we're just encouraged to perpetuate the same norms and values that are instilled in us at every other level of society. But the reason I'm drawing attention to this in this video is that I find it very interesting that the industry often presents itself as counterculture or as being anti-status quo in some way. And I think this is what makes it particularly insidious, because it gives us the impression that it's getting us to think for ourselves and question norms and values and worldviews. But at the same time, the underlying values of our society are always taken for granted. I think a good way to try and illustrate this is via the types of questions they encourage us to ask ourselves. For example, we're often encouraged to ponder what it is we truly want in life. And I think that's all well and good, but I think it's also important to ask ourselves, why do we want what we want? Who taught you to want that thing? When I asked myself at the age of 20 what I wanted, I would have said I wanted kids, I wanted marriage, I wanted a high-paying job, status and success. But it wasn't until I really started to question the concept of monogamy, question the nuclear family, understand the outside influences that had encouraged me to have these desires, that I realized that I only adopted those wants because society expected them of me. The same goes for the whole concept of realizing your power and awakening the giant within. But again, power for what? being a giant, for what purpose? Why is it we're always directed towards individualistic forms of power and agency rather than collective ones? And then there's the oft-recited question of, what would you do if you knew you would never fail? But why is something only worth doing if you knew you wouldn't fail? Isn't there value in the process and the enjoyment of doing something just because it's enjoyable, not necessarily for the purpose of reaching some goal or some reward at the end? And aren't many of the most important things in life, like relationships, activism, and working on yourself and healing your trauma, things that don't really have an endpoint? There isn't really a metric of failure or success. So should we really be directing our energies only towards things that have a clear outcome? So self-help is kind of interesting in this way because it makes us think we're thinking for ourselves. But in many ways, the questions are already rigged against us. So unless we are questioning the questions, we might just end up living by signifiers of success and based on what our society tells us we should want, rather than what we truly deeply want. And I think this is an incredibly widespread problem because according to the book, The 5 Regrets of the Dying, one of the top regrets is, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. And some people might say, well, what's wrong with living by societal standards? It's kind of normal, everyone does that. And yeah, I'm sure some people are perfectly content to live this way, but even a very neoliberal capitalist institution like Yale University came up with some surprisingly anti-capitalist, anti-neoliberal conclusions in their Science of Wellbeing course, because they found that the things that we think will make us happy but don't are things like having more money, technological advances, having a good job, having a lot of material possessions, having a great body, having great grades. In other words, the things that we are taught to strive towards. And then the things that do actually make us happy are things like gratitude, helping others via acts of service, social connection, savoring the moment, being present. And I don't think we need a Yale study to teach us this. I think a lot of us have experienced that intuitively when we've achieved a certain goal we were striving towards and it ends up being anticlimactic, and how a lot of the time the best things in life are things like relationships and friendships and little beautiful moments along the way. So the most important things in life usually can't be measured by these societal metrics of success. And on top of that, even if we accept that striving for success is something that we should be doing, usually that which is actually very successful, actually a work of genius, won't be recognized in our lifetimes because they weren't following societal metrics of success. For example, Galileo Galilei, the father of modern physics, was heavily ridiculed in his lifetime. The civil rights advocate Martin Luther King was on the FBI's enemy of the state list. The world-famous artist Vincent van Gogh was labelled crazy in his lifetime and ended up unaliving himself. The feminists, suffragettes, were widely despised and written about as wild animals. As the philosopher Osho put it, and if your work is the work of a genius, then you're not going to see any respect in your lifetime. Being respected by idiots, you have to behave according to their manners, their expectations. To be respected by this sick humanity, you have to be sicker than they are, then they will respect you. But what will you gain? You will lose your soul and you will gain nothing. So I think in the end, true liberation comes not from assimilating to the world as it is, but instead reconfiguring it, tearing it open, broadening your knowledge of different belief systems and value frameworks, and basing our sense of success on intrinsic rather than extrinsic values. I'm now 27 and I don't have any of the things that my younger 20-year-old self thought that I would have at this point. I don't have a partner, I don't have a high-paying job, I don't have kids, I don't have much money to my name. I don't have a house. I can fit all my possessions into one suitcase. I move to different homes, and in exchange for free accommodation, I do some work for them. Like at the moment, I'm doing gardening. So that means I can spend a lot of my time on creativity, which brings me a lot of joy. So by most people's standards, I am probably a failure, but I think I'm the happiest that I've ever been in my life. And that isn't to say that my way of living is better than other people's and that other people should live like me. In fact, I probably wouldn't recommend this to the majority of people. But what I am saying is that I've really interrogated the social norms and values that society has imposed on us. And this is the conclusion I came to as to how I want to spend my days. And you might come to other conclusions. You might decide that societal norms are what you want to follow, and that's perfectly valid, just so long as we are all realizing that so much of this is made up. So much of the way we live our lives is a social construct. We're all living in someone else's imagination, so we can also reimagine that and create our own worlds and our own ways of living. The final principle of self-help that I wanted to interrogate today is that it really instills in us a form of perfectionism where we're all supposed to have these huge aspirations and dreams and have perfect lives and perfect selves and perfect bodies and jobs and whatever else. We can become dismissive of humble moments and events because true joy and wonder and excitement is confined to this future fantasy land of perfection, not all around us in the mundane moments in the here and now. And it's kind of a losing game because no matter what you achieve and where you get to in life, there's always more to work on, more to achieve. So you're essentially a constantly failing subject, leading to a sense of dissatisfaction and failure throughout your whole entire existence. And why does everyone have to be extraordinary and have to have these huge aspirations? When did it become not okay just to be average?
I was the last generation of Americans where it was okay to be average. Old-timers might remember back in the day, the average person was average. And that was all right. You didn't have to disembowel yourself in the parking lot of your college if you got a B. A B was good. And we used to get drunk and tear down the goalposts on the football field and bring them into our dorm rooms. And I fear for the youth today because I think, again, without belaboring this point, that they are being held accountable for standards that are just not realistically attainable.
I think acceptance that life is imperfect and incomplete is a much happier way to live in general. I'm currently living in Spain and I don't want to romanticize it too much, but I get the feeling that here people don't have the same social conditioning that teaches them that they need to be a success and need to strive and need to attain. People seem relatively content to enjoy the day and to plod along. I'm currently dating a guy who's a waiter, and I think one of the things that attracts me to him is that he doesn't have these huge aspirations or this sense that his self-worth is built off of his job or his status or money or success. He just enjoys his days and he's a very happy and contented being. I had a conversation with him where I was like, I feel like I'm always in front of my laptop working and you seem to always enjoy your days. And he was like, yeah, enjoying each day is kind of the point. And I was like, oh yeah, you're right. It sounds so obvious to me now. And some people push back against this and say, well, why accept being average when you could live a much better, more perfect life? But firstly, like I said, I think you can actually be more contented by letting go of that striving. But also, is perfection even something that is desirable in the first place? I think perfectionism can often be a double-edged sword. You have the most beautiful body in the world, and suddenly aging becomes incredibly terrifying. You have all the money in the world, and so you have infinite options of what you could be doing with it, and suddenly any option you choose becomes dissatisfying because there's always a sense that there could be something better you could be doing. It's kind of like when you see the influencers online that seem so perfect, or you meet people in real life with the perfect bodies and the perfect lives, that they somehow seem dead inside. Or the people who follow the exact right schedules and discipline and are time blocked and have everything so correctly organized that they end up seeming like a robot or machine living this automated existence. Or when you see that perfect piece of art where everything is exactly as it should be, that in some way it loses its magic. I believe it was Cornel West that said, sometimes peacocks strut because they cannot fly. Sometimes people that emanate the most perfection on the outside have the least substance on the inside. Part of what can explain this deadness and lack of substance is that we're all encouraged to somehow become homogeneous humans. We're all given this ideal in self-help of what is a perfect kind of person to strive towards being. Usually they're charismatic, confident, very conventional, attractive, extroverted, and then everyone's trying to mold themselves to this ideal, and it becomes incredibly jarring. When I went to the US, I remember finding it so strange because I felt like I met the same exact person again and again and again in 100 different bodies, because everyone was so loud and everyone was so extroverted and had these big personalities. And I understand we're all culturally different depending on where we are from, but I find it sad when everyone's trying to become the exact same person that is supposed to be the ideal. I would much rather that people embrace their idiosyncrasies and their strangeness. I like it when I meet someone who's got some strange quirk about them. I think often it's those weird things about people that attract us to them, that makes them somehow interesting and unique and special. I like the fact that I'm sometimes socially awkward and don't always say the right things, and often asking weird questions and saying things that are inappropriate at the wrong times. But I think even though it might be weird for a lot of people, I then attract the type of people that understand me and I understand them quite easily. But I think for a lot of neurodivergent people like me, it can be very easy, since we're so used to masking so often, to try and become like this ideal homogeneous human all the time, which I think is so sad. My dad is also another example. He's incredibly flatulent all the time, and by most people's standards that would be quite a big flaw of his, but I think it makes him somehow funny and interesting, and it makes him who he is, and I like that he embraces it about himself. I think it would be so great if all of us stopped watering down our personalities to become as palatable as possible to a broader audience, and instead embraced who we actually are, not just on a personal level, but also on a political level. This can be helpful because I believe that we are all part of this wider ecosystem, and just like in an ecosystem, each different thing has its role. The tree has its role, the beaver has its role, whatever else. I think we all have our own roles in this broader ecosystem, and sometimes elevating one being above the others can make the whole ecosystem go out of whack, because then instead of us each having our own individual function in the ecosystem, we strive to be that elevated thing, rather than realizing that there is no function that is more important in the ecosystem. Everything has its role, everything is valuable. Biodiversity is how ecosystems function. The more diverse the people we have, the more diverse the roles and functions and things that we do in general. Obviously there's exceptions, but in general, I think that is a healthier, more functioning world. So a good general question to ask ourselves, I think, and something I've been asking myself a lot, is to what extent am I holding myself to standards of perfection that are impossible to meet? And instead, I'm trying to adopt a general attitude of self-acceptance and love and contentedness with where I'm at and with who I am. Because if I'm constantly waiting to accept and love myself at a future point when I'm finally perfect, it's very unlikely to actually happen. And instead of trying to be extraordinary, I like to embrace Osho's phrase, to live that ordinariness in an extraordinary way. In other words, seeing the beauty in the everyday mundane moments in the here and now, instead of it being relegated to this fantasy land of perfection in the future. And also just accepting our individual roles in our ecosystems, becoming okay with our unique contributions in this larger body of this world, rather than needing to strive for some socially constructed ideal of perfection. I think self-help often does the work of 100 policemen, dictators, and censors far more effectively and cheaply. It helps to weave us into this self-censored, self-policed, self-controlled state where we're like, perfect me, control me, tell me what to want, make me like everyone else, make me a hard-working cog in this machine. And of course, not all self-help books are equally bad. Like I said, I'm still reading them, so clearly I haven't completely let go of the idea that self-help book is good for my life. But at the same time, I still think it's important to ask ourselves, what messages from self-help have we internalized? How is the soldier, dictator, or policeman living within me? How can I unlearn this? How can I get to the most liberated version of myself? And I think it can be helpful to embrace this kind of radical curiosity more broadly too. I like to think of myself as an anthropologist from Mars. If I were an alien creature seeing Earth for the first time, what would I think about the ways we live and organize society? What values and norms would I question? What would I challenge? I think this way of being can open up such an enchanted world of possibilities, because instead of accepting the world as it is, we instead have the far more exciting possibility of reimagining the world and constructing how to live on our own terms rather than that which has been prescribed to us, which I think is one of the best ways we can live. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you like this video, please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. And you may like my video on time management myths, because that is an aspect of self-help that is its own beast. I also made a video on how self-help is a scam. I would also really appreciate if you could consider becoming a patron or leaving a one-time tip on Ko-fi or PayPal. If you become a patron, I create monthly vlogs where I talk about things that are alive within me right now that I wouldn't put out in public. And thank you so much to my current patrons for helping me to create the videos I want to make, rather than following the socially imposed ideas of what I should make based on the algorithm or based on broader society. I appreciate you so much. Bye!